There's something wrong in this country.
Well, second time in a year, almost a year to the day, I got laid off again.
I always try to figure out, like, do I pay the electric and the fuel and the groceries and the overdue credit card bill?
Rural American households are now paying, on average, an extra $400 per year for basic goods and services as a direct result of rising import tariffs and ongoing supply chain disruptions. This isn't just an economic footnote, it's a wake-up call. In communities already struggling with limited access to jobs, healthcare, and broadband, every dollar counts. And now, the same voters who were once the most loyal supporters of an America First trade agenda are feeling the ground shift beneath their feet. Across small towns and farming regions, the promise of renewed economic strength is starting to look more like a financial burden and a broken pledge. From the price of eggs and prescription medication to the cost of farm equipment and imported materials, rural Americans are experiencing an economic squeeze that feels both relentless and deeply personal. Many believed they were voting for policies that would revive their local economies and protect domestic jobs. Instead, they're now grappling with higher costs, fewer options, and a growing sense of betrayal. In towns across America's heartland, the economic consequences of recent trade policies have become unmistakable and, for many, inescapable. A CNN business report, April 2025, found that the average cost of imported consumer goods has risen 12 to 20% in just the past 6 months due to newly imposed tariffs disproportionately affecting rural households where incomes tend to be lower and alternatives more limited. This inflation hits hardest at the grocery store and pharmacy. A dozen eggs that once cost $2.50 now sell for nearly $9 in some regions. Essential medications like generic blood pressure or insulin treatments have spiked in price due to import costs and disrupted global supply chains. These aren't luxuries, they're staples of daily survival, and their price surge is being felt in farm towns and remote counties long dependent on thin, carefully balanced household budgets. The agricultural sector, long seen as a pillar of rural prosperity, has taken an especially severe blow. According to the New York Times, April 2025, China, historically one of the largest buyers of U.S. soybeans and grain, has shifted much of its purchasing to Brazil and Argentina, following steep tariff escalations. This has caused a 23% drop in U.S. soybean exports, with rural farmers in Iowa, Kansas, and the Dakotas reporting losses in the tens of thousands per season. For many, the market has disappeared while production costs, especially fertilizers, fuel, and imported machinery parts, have soared. Meanwhile, small businesses, the supposed beneficiaries of Buy American rhetoric, are struggling to stay afloat. CNN reports that over 40% of small manufacturers reliant on foreign raw materials have had to raise prices or cut staff to absorb tariff-related cost hikes. In rural areas where each small business supports a network of families and local services, these disruptions quickly cascade into larger economic instability. For the very communities that once rallied behind promises of economic revival, the reality now feels starkly different. The rising cost of living, coupled with shrinking export opportunities and thinning safety nets, has left many rural Americans not only frustrated, but questioning whether they've been forgotten by the very agenda that claimed to champion them. Among the states hit hardest by these economic shifts, Kentucky has become a clear and compelling example of the unintended consequences of national trade policy colliding with local economic realities. Governor Andy Beshear, a Democrat who won re-election in a deeply conservative state, has emerged as a vocal critic of the tariff regime's effect on working-class and rural communities. His warnings aren't abstract, they are rooted in lived experience and constituent outcry. In recent interviews, Beshear emphasized that major employers in Kentucky, like UPS, have announced layoffs, citing rising operational costs linked to the tariff environment. But the damage isn't limited to big business. Small manufacturers in the state, many of whom rely on imported raw materials they cannot source domestically, are also shedding jobs. These aren't faceless statistics. They are churchgoers, little league coaches, and neighbors, now unemployed in places with few alternative job prospects. The state's farmers have faced a double blow, first from climate-related events like historic flooding, and second from trade retaliation that has shrunk access to foreign markets, particularly China, which had been a key buyer of U.S. soybeans. In regions dependent on agriculture, commodity prices have dropped, even as input costs, especially fuel and fertilizers, continue to rise, further eroding already thin profit margins. Kentucky's iconic bourbon industry, a source of cultural pride and export income, has also found itself caught in the crossfire. Canada, a major buyer of U.S. whiskey, imposed retaliatory tariffs in response to Trump-era trade decisions, leaving distilleries burdened with unsold inventory and lost revenue. For rural counties that depend on these producers for jobs and tourism, this isn't a niche issue. It's a growing economic strain. Beshear also flagged what he called a quieter but equally dangerous development: the federal government's resistance to funding digital infrastructure in underserved communities. Rural broadband access, long delayed and uneven, was expected to expand significantly under the Digital Equity Act, a bipartisan initiative to bring high-speed internet to poor and rural regions. However, as the current administration labels such programs unconstitutional or divisive, key federal dollars remain frozen. The result: entire regions remain cut off from remote work, telemedicine, and online education, all crucial tools for economic mobility in the 21st century. What Beshear's critique illustrates is a deeper disconnect between top-down economic messaging and bottom-up reality. The promise was prosperity, self-sufficiency, and a renewed industrial backbone. What rural communities like those in Kentucky have received instead is rising costs, shrinking opportunity, and a growing sense that their loyalty has been met with indifference. To be fair, supporters of the tariff strategy argue that the current strain is part of a necessary adjustment, a short-term pain for long-term gain. They contend that repatriating manufacturing and reducing dependency on foreign suppliers, particularly China, is not a process that yields results overnight. From their perspective, the recent challenges reflect growing pains in a broader effort to build a more resilient, self-sufficient American economy. Proponents also point to cases where domestic industries such as certain steel and aluminum producers have seen a modest uptick in demand due to tariff protections. They argue that these early signs of industrial recovery justify staying the course, even if rural communities bear the initial burden. In their view, patience and persistence are needed to see the full benefits of reshoring efforts materialize. To understand how rural America is processing the current economic landscape, it's important to start with why so many of these voters supported the policies in question to begin with. For years, even decades, rural communities have felt overlooked by national politics. Factories closed, farms consolidated, schools and hospitals underfunded. Politicians often made promises, but tangible progress rarely reached beyond urban and suburban centers. Against this backdrop, messages of economic nationalism and America First policies resonated deeply. They weren't just policy points, they were a restoration of dignity. Trade protectionism especially held a strong appeal. It was framed not just as a strategy to boost the economy, but as a moral imperative, a way to reclaim what was lost, to stand up to global forces that seemed to be taking more than they gave. Voters weren't simply choosing a candidate, they were choosing a story in which they mattered again. For many, that story was overdue. But as the practical effects of tariffs and trade wars have begun to manifest, particularly through rising prices, lost markets, and job losses, cracks are forming in that narrative. What was promised as economic empowerment now feels to some like another in a long string of broken assurances. The difference this time is that the consequences are tangible and close to home. When a neighbor is laid off, or a local farm goes under, or the internet still hasn't arrived in a small town school, faith in broad promises starts to fade. Still, the emotional bond between rural voters and the populist political messaging they embraced isn't so easily broken. Identity plays a major role. Many voters see their support not just as a policy preference, but as an assertion of cultural belonging, even defiance. Changing one's political allegiance can feel like betraying a worldview, a community, even oneself. That's why for some it's easier to blame external forces, media, political elites, or deep state institutions than to reconsider the policy itself. And yet a quiet reassessment is underway. As Governor Andy Beshear noted, people are starting to feel betrayed, not in a partisan sense, but in a deeply personal one. The policies they supported were supposed to lift them up. Instead, they're struggling harder than ever to get by. That tension between political loyalty and lived experience is now reshaping conversations across coffee shops, grain elevators, and kitchen tables in America's rural heartland. The story of tariffs, trade wars, and rural backlash is not just about economics, it's about expectation and trust. It's about the promises made to communities long left behind by globalization and automation, and what happens when those promises collide with a more complicated reality. As costs rise, markets shrink, and federal support stalls, rural Americans once enthusiastic about nationalist economic policies are beginning to ask hard questions, not just about their leaders, but about the very structure of the economy they live in. What's unfolding is a quiet reckoning not always expressed in headlines or protests, but in conversations at the local diner, budget adjustments at the kitchen table, and election turnout decisions still taking shape. It's not necessarily a shift in ideology, but a recalibration of expectations, a growing realization that slogans do not automatically translate into solvency, and that economic patriotism must be paired with real grounded policy execution. This moment offers a rare chance for reflection, not just for political parties, but for the country at large. If rural America is to thrive, it will require more than promises of resurgence or rhetorical battles with foreign powers. It will require strategic investment in infrastructure, education, digital connectivity, healthcare, and local industry. And above all, it will require leaders who listen not just during election years, but through the long, difficult work of governance. The question now is not only whether current policies are working, but whether those in power are willing to re-examine, revise, and re-engage with the people who trusted them most. For rural Americans, resilient, resourceful, and rooted, the stakes are real. And for the rest of the country, what happens next in these communities may well define the tone and direction of national politics in the years ahead.